Welcome everyone and thanks for joining. My name's Ollie, I'm the Managing Director at Bulletproof and I'm going to be presenting today how to manage a modern cybersecurity strategy. But before we get started, a bit about me. I've been in the security industry for over 15 years now. I've been a penetration tester, I've been a security consultant, and as an evangelist I like to talk to organisations about security technologies, and over the last 10 years or so I spent a lot of time talking to organisations about SIEM technologies and building effective SOCs and using the right tooling and what tooling to look out for and what you need to look out for to detect attacks. And so today we're going to be focusing on quite a bit of technology, how to get the right data in and to look at SIEM and what works and what doesn't work, and we'll be going through that today. So what are you going to learn in today's webinar? Well, first and foremost, we're going to talk about who are targets for attackers at the moment. We're going to look at how do you detect an attack, what are the things you need to be capturing, how do you spot it as early as possible. We're going to be looking at how you can turn raw log data into events. To do that, I'm going to take a case study and I'm going to take you through forensics investigation and the lessons learned from that. We're also going to be looking at tooling. What are the tools you really need? Obviously, machine learning has got a lot of hype over the years. Looking at how can we better effectively use intelligence, or looking at intelligence data, or is there something else, some other tool you might need, and looking at that. And then, of course, the last part here is to look at how you can tackle this evolving landscape. Not only are attackers changing their approach and targeting different parts of your organization, but equally, of course, we as organizations are working differently with things like cloud and container technology. So we'll be looking at that as well and talking a bit about that. So let's get straight into it. Who are the targets? Well, when you look at it, pretty much everyone. And the reason why we say that is because when you start to put systems on the internet, servers on the internet, and you expose yourself as an organization, you open yourself up to attack. When we've looked at that, so when we've actually put out systems on the internet ourselves, we generally find within about 5 minutes the system's already under attack and it's been targeted by not necessarily always attackers, but sometimes automated tools looking for systems that are vulnerable to attack to try and see if they can interrogate them, to identify if there's any way to exploit those systems. So pretty much as soon as you put something on the internet, there's a good chance that something's going to find it and it's going to attempt to see if it's exploitable. And that's a daunting prospect. So let's break it down into a number of key risks. So the first one is, do you have sensitive data? Because if you do, then there's a good chance that an attacker will start to try and get access to that data. And if you do, where is it? As security professionals, we really want to help organizations protect that data. But the only way to do it is if we know where the data is. And of course, your security strategy should be aligned to where that data is. So you really need to understand where your data is and where does it transit. With a big internet presence becomes a much bigger target, and attackers have a greater opportunity of finding vulnerabilities in systems. And also you've got to think about the potential risks of somebody making mistakes and opening up things like firewall rules to systems that shouldn't be exposed to the internet. So having a big internet presence really puts a target on your back because an attacker has a greater opportunity to exploit your systems. Now, if you're an organization that's running systems in the cloud, because it's a relatively new technology, still many organizations still trying to learn how to protect those systems and how to monitor them. And with some of the legacy technologies out there, they don't have a very good way to give you coverage of protecting those systems. The other thing that organizations are doing is they're choosing to pick different cloud technologies and providers for different services and solutions. And in many cases, the support across all of the cloud platforms is not equal when you're looking at things like SIEM technologies. So it's key to make sure that you have a good understanding of all the technologies you're using in the cloud to be able to make sure that you've got the right technology that can detect across all of those cloud providers. Now, the other thing as well is, as you implement new technologies, it's interesting to the attackers because the attackers realize that organizations that are adopting new technologies don't necessarily know how to protect them yet. So they've been focusing on building the latest capabilities to attack these new systems, things like container technologies, things like Docker and things like cloud instances. Attackers are trying to find new ways to exploit those systems and also the misconfiguration in those systems by organizations. Remember, it's not always about hacking something. Sometimes it's about just finding the flaws in logic or finding where people have made a misconfiguration in some of these new technologies that could lead to them getting access to sensitive data. The last thing, of course, is the evolving landscape. And what we mean by this is technologies are changing, and you need to have security controls and security technologies that can support those new technologies, those evolving technologies. The other thing as well is the attackers are always changing their approaches, the ways in which they target systems and users, because they are finding new and better ways to really achieve their goals and to get the most out of their time. So we need to keep ahead of that, and there are ways in which to do that, which we'll talk about. The last part is if you're migrating solutions, think about what the current state of security is of the systems you're currently running, and as you migrate them into, say, cloud technologies as an example, you need to make sure that you're following and applying the same level of security once you've made that move into the cloud. In this next part, let's look at how we detect an attack. So in order to understand how to detect an attack, we need to think about how we're going to be protecting ourselves. And one of the key things we need to look at is making sure we have a robust security strategy. That strategy needs to include a few key things. One, experienced staff that are going to be able to know how to detect the potential threats. So making sure they have the right detection capabilities in place, whether they're logging the right information. So you need that level of experience, but equally they need to know what to do with a potential piece of log data or an alert raised by a security tool. They need to know what the next action is. How do they triage it further? How do they validate how risky that potential activity is? Making sure they know how to prioritize events and detect the further attack. That needs to be done really on a 24/7 basis. So making sure that you have a log monitoring strategy that's effective and doing it on a 24/7 basis, because attackers will target you all hours of the day. Of course, if there are new vulnerabilities come out, the first thing the opportunistic attacker will do is scan the internet looking for systems that have that potential vulnerability. And of course, if it's a target attacker, they might take the opportunity to do something out of hours because they expect there to not be quite as many security controls in place. And of course, your guard is slightly down because maybe you don't have a 24/7 SOC team. The other thing that you need to be looking at, I know it's a bit of a buzzword in the industry at the moment, is threat hunting. But what that means is taking intelligence data that's specific to your industry, identifying those things that are key and threatening to your business, and making sure that you have a way to detect that sort of activity. So if there's a new campaign out that targets your specific industry vertical, you might want to then go and investigate whether you, one, have the right type of data to detect it. So if it's a piece of malware, how does it operate? When it hits your network, is it going to spread? If it is, how do you detect that activity? If it drops files, what types of files does it drop? Where does it put them? All those sorts of things. So that's how you can then hunt for that in your networks. The last part, of course, to make sure your security strategy is really robust and you have a limited attack surface area, it's a good practice to, of course, do regular pen testing and vulnerability scanning so that your team, your experts that are monitoring your environment, know where the big risks are and know where to focus their investigation into, and of course help them to identify how to prioritize activities that they do see and events they see in the network. But how realistic is this? You know, it's easier said than done, right? Because trying to find an experienced security team is very difficult. It's expensive in a lot of cases. People don't have the budget to build a 24/7 team and to fill it full of the top talent. And the top talent, of course, are being targeted by lots and lots of organizations. So it's very difficult to get the right people in place. And then on top of that, not only is it difficult to keep the resources in place, managing that schedule of work. So we have to do it, of course, with our SOC team and keeping abreast of people taking time off and people getting sick, or you needing to hire for capacity because you're getting more data and you're getting more technologies and you're getting more systems you have to monitor. It's very difficult to manage. The proactive hunting side of things, it's quite a niche talent. You know, it's something that relies on researchers, people that can go and find the latest intelligence. You have to ingest intelligence feeds, you have to buy those feeds, or you have to use open source feeds, and you have to keep them up to date. And a lot of the time, the intelligence is coming in great volumes, and figuring out which intelligence data to focus on and which data is important to your business or the things that you should care about becomes a bit more difficult. And so building the right picking the right technology and building the right tools and getting the right people on board to do that becomes a bit of a headache. And of course, penetration testing is often just a point-in-time thing. So although it's the kind of people element to picking out those vulnerabilities that can help you to remediate them, it's only that once in time. So unless you've got an unlimited budget to keep doing pen tests throughout the year, which some organizations do have, but many don't, you only have that the point in time view of what's going on in the environment. Now, of course, we're massive advocates, as are many other organizations, and of course security best practices around doing vulnerability scanning, and that does really help you to keep a regular understanding of what's going on in the environment, and then feed that back into your security teams so that they can be informed as to what potential threats there are and what you can then do to remediate them. So if we're not doing regular testing, or we can't afford to do regular testing, I mean, obviously we could do regular vulnerability scanning, but more targeted testing. The next real thing is to look at how we can proactively monitor our environment to try and detect an attack. And one of the best ways to do that is to look at the kill chain, look at how the attackers operate, and then position technologies in the right places so you can detect the attack as early on as possible, so you can reduce dwell time. So what we're doing when we're talking to our customers, giving them sort of best practice advice, and of course when we're deploying our technologies, is to make sure that we can detect all these different areas of the kill chain. So can we spot somebody trying reconnaissance activity? Because we can detect it there, then it means we can reduce the time to detection, so we can block the attack before it becomes a problem to our customers. When it comes into kind of weaponization and coming up with payloads, that's normally related to research. So make sure you research the types of attacks that they might target you with, so the latest tools and techniques, and then making sure you can detect the activity of those tools and techniques in your environment. So again, you can detect it earlier on in the kill chain as possible. When it gets to exploitation, it's looking at identifying when they're trying to exploit vulnerabilities and knowing what your vulnerabilities are through things like the penetration testing, which you mentioned last time. And of course, also then monitoring if they try and install software or they try and drop things on the system. And then the last part is, are they trying to make connections out of your environment and perform malicious activities in your network? All these things help you to detect the attack as early as possible, and again, are key to detecting the stages of attack as early as possible. So with that in mind, with the kill chain in mind, let's have a look at a forensic investigation that Bulletproof did and see how we can turn those raw logs into actionable events you can do something about. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to take a look at a forensics investigation that we did. And this organization was hit by a piece of ransomware called Ryuk. Ryuk's actually made the press fairly recently, where it's been very successful and been some fairly serious organizations being hit by it. This organization also wanted to know how, when it occurred, so they've got the full timeline of events that we helped them to build, and then who was responsible for it. The organization was concerned that they were being targeted by nation state because Ryuk's been used previously in nation state attacks, so they wanted us to help with attribution. Attribution is really difficult to get some clarity on who actually did it, but we had a good go at it. We won't talk about that today, but we've done a blog around it as well, so worthwhile looking that up. And was there anything they could have done to prevent it? And of course, going forward, lessons learned, what can they do in the future to stop that from happening? And hopefully in the next few slides, we can help you to do the same. So here's what happened. The attackers managed to get a dropper file to be installed by a domain admin account onto the desktop. A dropper file essentially is a file that helps to get the ransomware deployed and installed. This was on day 0. Now what you'll notice is that 2 days later, somebody ran that dropper file, and then it started building the ransomware, and then the ransomware was then executed, and the ransomware started encrypting files. And so on day 2, we then started seeing these .ryk files being created on the servers themselves, which essentially means that the files are being encrypted. We then saw the server being shut down by a user, which essentially means that or what we understood to happen is that the organization was trying to figure out what was going on, because they saw some errors and some systems failing, and so they rebooted the system thinking that might fix it. But then and then we see the system event log was stopped, and then we saw the system being restarted. So essentially what happened was they tried to reboot the system to remediate the problem. So the key thing is, what didn't we see? So in this case, one of the things we didn't see, and we see this quite often with our customers, is that they aren't logging file changes. So there was no evidence in the logs that any files have been changed because it wasn't being recorded at all. So we observed that during the investigation, and the first thing we did was went and looked at a special location in the operating system to see all changes to the files on the system, to identify the kind of first changes that could indicate a sign of compromise, and that's where we found this dropper file. The next thing, of course, is that it took 2 days before anybody actually executed this dropper file. And at that point, we didn't see any processes being executed when it actually was run, because they weren't logging processes being executed. But we know that file was run because when we took that file away and ran it ourselves in a sandbox to see what happens, we noticed that the file then created another executable, which was the ransomware. So we know the executable was run. There was no evidence that it had been run, but of course, if we'd have been logging the processes, we would have known that. And again, we could have detected it early, potentially stopped things like files being encrypted, and try and deal with that problem in advance. Now, of course, modern SIEM technologies and many of the SIEM technologies out there should have or have this functionality. And that's one of the things to observe. Can you monitor things like file changes without having to buy an extra tool to do it and processes? Because an indication of a good SIEM tool is that they can capture these things without needing third-party software. The other thing as well that helps, of course, to do the investigation is if you know what the version of the operating system is. If it's a really old version of the operating system that is vulnerable to attack, then there's a good chance that this thing should be a higher priority and could have been compromised already. So again, knowing that helps your analysts and your security professionals in your business to decide on which things they focus on first. And of course, one of the last things that is always a key indicator, are you seeing strange anomalous activity on the network that could suggest either the system is trying to propagate or trying to get sensitive data out of the network. And observing those really help you to detect the attack. So the next question is, what tools do we really need to detect an attack? What we're really looking for is a technology that can help us to predict the future, much like Dr. Strange in Endgame, where he went forward to look at every single scenario that they went through during the conflict, and obviously found one scenario where they actually won the conflict. We kind of want the same thing with our SIEM technologies and our security technologies. We are expecting them to be able to predict what bad things are going to happen next. But often that's not what we get. We're getting the tools and they're not really delivering what we're expecting. What we often land up with is technologies that have gotten a bad press, and one of those is certainly SIEM technologies. And it's a number of reasons why that's the case. One of them is that SIEM technologies are often being oversold by the vendors themselves, and there's an overpromise there to what the actual capabilities are. Sometimes that's because it's just a misunderstanding of the product, and the product itself has a finite level of support for environments, and it can't necessarily support all the environments, or doesn't have a complete level of support for all the environments. And sometimes organizations get those technologies in and then realize, well, actually it's not going to add a great deal of value for me. More often than not, it's due to misconfiguration. So the technology gets put into the environment and the initial deployment hasn't been tuned over the years, or hasn't been tuned very well in the beginning, and so you land up with a lot of noise. Sometimes just a lack of understanding on the tool. So we've seen this in many cases where organizations have invested in a tool. That person who originally invested in the tool then left their business, that somebody else has come in to pick the tool up, and over time there's a general lack of understanding of what the tool was originally purchased for, what it was supposed to be doing, how it was working originally, and then who was supposed to be maintaining it and keeping it up to date. Often that leads to things like alert fatigue, where a technology just keeps screaming at you to say that there's something bad going on, but every time you look at it, you can't understand why it's giving you all these alerts, or you don't really understand the alerts themselves, so it's difficult to decide what you need to do with them. And what lands up happening is, in many cases, organizations still get hacked, and they wonder why all this investment in security technologies hasn't fulfilled on its original plan, and hasn't really achieved what they originally original goal of what they expected to get from the technology. And so what we tend to find is there's a bit of a negativity around these sorts of technologies. So let's have a look at what a modern SIEM technology should have in it, and what we would expect from a modern SIEM technology. And then we'll take this data and we'll go and have a look at some of the other things that you can look to do with a SIEM technology, what to get out of it and how to get the most out of it. So the first thing really is the events and the alerts. You need to be smart about how you use them. So again, if you think about the alert fatigue problem, you're continually getting badgered about the technology. If you're not doing anything with those alerts, or they're not making any sense to you, then really they're just compounding the problem around the alert fatigue. So it's better to switch those off, or to focus on how to get more value from them and identify why they will be continually alerting you to stuff that you don't care about. The other thing around it is that in most cases, what we're expecting people to do with SIEM technologies as security professionals is to go and actually investigate and prioritize the data. And in a lot of cases, the technology is not very good at helping you to prioritize because it's not ingesting enough information. You may get 25 high alerts. Which one of those high alerts is the first one to look at? And that really comes down to knowledge of what to do with the events and what the events mean and the alerts mean that come out of these platforms. But ultimately, it also comes down to making sure that you have the right data to help support those alerts so you can decide on which one to focus on first. And a good example I've already mentioned is that if you know that a system is vulnerable, that's the one you should focus on. For those things that are high risk, but you don't know necessarily where they're vulnerable yet, and they could or couldn't be, you need to go and figure that out and find that information out. But if you already know it, then and something's going to be vulnerable, you should go and focus on that one because you know that you can fix it and you need to remediate that quickly. A modern SIEM technology, the expectation is that in this day and age, because of the way in which attackers are continually evolving and changing the way they attack your systems and targeting new and interesting things, you really need to do the active threat hunting. So what that means is we need to be taking the intelligence data that we're getting from either the platform or another source of information, the news, a threat intelligence feed, whatever that may be, and go and look for that activity environment and actually be proactive about looking at this data rather than just waiting for a report to land on your desk. The last thing as well is one of the biggest things that we've seen over the years, of course, is the increase in the amount of data that we're having to process. Because more and more systems are generating logs, more and more systems are publicly facing because people want to interface with their customers and their employees with web tools and APIs and all these sorts of things. So it means that there's lots more data and lots more evidence that needs to be investigated than what we've ever seen before. So if you cast your mind back to the beginning of the webinar, we talked about the kill chain, and what we want to make sure that we're doing is we have all the right evidence to be able to detect the attacks as early as possible. So we need to arm our security pros in our companies with all the right tools to be able to detect that data. And I think this is a useful little tool, a little guide for you guys to have a look at because it kind of shows what we tend to be looking at with our customers and the things that our analysts find very useful to detect each stage of the attack. So make sure you're bringing in things like firewall logs, you're looking at your AV logs, you have email filtering solutions in place, but again, collating all that log data into one place, because when we're investigating incidents, we want all the data in one single place so that we can build a timeline, a line of events. So taking it from, if we see an event that happens at 9 o'clock in the morning, show me everything for the last hour, last 2 hours, and that should include all of the activity. If the user received an email, if the user accessed a server, if the user opened a file, if the user executed a process at that time, we're trying to figure out why they might be doing all that and building a bit of a timeline of events. I'm sure people who've been watching the security industry over the last few years have seen the increase in activity around machine learning type technologies, and I'm sure you're asking yourself, why have we not been talking about that already? The key thing to note is that it's not black magic, right? The machine learning technologies are not at the stage yet where they're going to be taking over the world because they're full artificial intelligence and they can figure everything out for themselves, and they're going to completely take the need for us to have a security professional in our teams. It's definitely not the case right now. So with machine learning, although the technology is getting better and better, and we're starting to understand how we can really utilize the technology in the security space, what's generally happened up until this point is it's a very good aid for the security analysts out there. So for those people having to process lots of data, it's a very good tool, but it doesn't go without its challenges. Much like with the SIEM technology itself, it still needs to be tuned. There's a lot of discussion around unsupervised and supervised machine learning. The reality is that supervised machine learning gives you much better quality of data and information out the back of it, and it needs expertise to be able to manage and maintain these things. So yes, you need to look at machine learning data to be able to scale your team. Like, you can't expect one analyst to go through billions of log data, so you need machine learning, and your security professionals is the same. Your security professionals in your company that are doing your security analyst work for you, they can't scale themselves, so bringing in machine learning will help them to scale better and gives them the opportunity to focus in just those things that the machine learning has raised and to help then continue to tune that. And so now if we think about it, it's kind of not the magic fix. It's not the thing that's just going to solve all our problems for us. There are other things that you really need to think about that will help to aid your analyst team and the people that are looking at your security events. What data are we going to use machine learning on? What information do we have? Now, one of the key things we find a lot is that user behavior is one of the biggest challenges, because humans act differently every single day. And if you're looking at event data and there's huge amounts of it, machine learning can really help with that to pick out trends of activity that could potentially be a threat to the business and allow you to focus on those events rather than having to trawl through every single activity from an individual user. I mentioned this already. I would highly advise looking at technologies where you're more involved in the supervised machine learning, where the technology is being helped along by an expert in machine learning. And can you get the data is the key question. Like, if you're going to go and throw a technology in, do you have the right data to help to feed the machine learning engine? Is the technology you're using able to collect the data that it will then use, or are you having to feed it? And then how does that work? And do you have the right data to enable it to be able to do its job? And then last but not least, of course, who's tuning this system? Okay, so I guess that leaves us with, would SIEM have made a difference in this case? You know, if we'd looked at that investigation earlier, would that organization have benefited from a SIEM technology? I certainly think a SIEM technology would have helped, provided it was set up in the right way. So let's take a few of those examples from the investigation. First and foremost, the dropper file. If you have a technology like file integrity monitoring that's monitoring for file changes, and you're sending that into your SIEM technology, that's a really good indicator that somebody's not following best practice, especially in this case where they were dropping files into the desktop location on a server without a change request. That was strange and wouldn't be a typical approach, and so spotting that would have been the initial indicator. A lot of the modern SIEM technologies have this capability already to detect file changes, so worthwhile looking at that. The dropper should have been isolated by antivirus solutions on the system. At the time in which we did the investigation, the dropper file was already being detected by the majority of the antivirus solutions out there. It was also being detected by Windows Defender, so that should have solved the problem immediately. The other key thing is to feed that data into the SIEM technology. So if a file has been removed and the AV has detected malicious files on their system, then it's something that should be triaged and investigated, because there's a good chance that either somebody's not followed good practice and has landed up on a site that has malicious content, or you're a target for attack, and there could be an early sign that somebody's trying to target your environment. The next thing, of course, is that if you're monitoring certain file locations, the changes of files by the malware would have been spotted. So there are things that the malicious software tries to do, like create temporary files potentially, manipulate certain locations that are critical to getting the ransomware to execute. And all these things would have been spotted, as well as, of course, files being encrypted. Now, of course, that's pretty much like the fact that the system's already encrypting it and the horse is almost bolted already. But the reality is that with these sorts of encryption systems, you might be able to stop it from encrypting the systems, and then, of course, saving data that might be backed up. So that might benefit you for those systems that haven't been backed up already. And of course, you could have prevented the encryption had all these things been detected early enough on. You could have stopped the executable from being run, and of course, that would have meant that the software wouldn't have actually been able to start encrypting systems at all. Okay, so now in this next section, what we're going to do is look at how to tackle the evolving landscape. Of course, with cloud and container technologies now being widely adopted, we need to think about securing them and what technologies we need and how SIEM can help, and of course what you need from a SIEM technology to do that. So let's have a look at that in the next section. Organizations are of course already using cloud and container technologies, and I don't think not all of the organizations that are going investing in these solutions know enough about the technology when they go into them. And of course that's why the attackers are now targeting them, because they see it as an opportunity where somebody might be running these services but not maybe have configured them in a secure way, and so they're starting to target them. And containers can still be hacked just because they're only being used for certain functions, and they may only be running for short periods of time. They can still be hacked, they still have vulnerabilities, and we have to be diligent about how we build these systems to make it easy for us to then patch them. Obviously, the ideal approach is you have a gold build that gets deployed out to many of these systems, and then if you need to rebuild them or patch them or upgrade them, you can easily just rebuild them from the gold image. And the fact that servers are ephemeral may seem like, in actual fact, because they're only live for a short period of time, that means that the attackers are going to have a harder job. And they might not be able to keep their persistence on the server because it will be rebuilt and started again. And if it gets tainted, well, it's only going to be there for a little while. The point is they're still vulnerable. And if you find a vulnerability in one server that's running in a cloud environment and it's ephemeral, then there's a good chance the next one that spins up is going to have the same vulnerabilities. The hackers just need to think smarter and faster, and they can still hack them. So we can benefit from it by going and be able to patch those systems a lot quicker, but also there are some negatives to it. And we need to consider when we're protecting our systems. The other key thing, of course, is that cloud accounts can get hacked. So if you're not thinking about good security practice and using things like 2FA and strong passwords, and your account gets hacked, we've seen several scenarios of this in the press that suggest that, of course, it can be game over material for many organizations, especially if a lot of their services are in the cloud. And then, of course, the last part is many organizations are more moving towards cloud services are a normal thing inside of business. It's not anything new. And so security technologies need to keep up with that and need to continue to integrate with these cloud services, things like Office 365, and really help organizations to ingest all the right information and help them to detect those attacks because they still can be targets. And in actual fact, because it's becoming the norm, there's a greater chance of them targeting your cloud services in the future. Okay, so that just leaves me to summarize the slides really and to wrap up. So first and foremost, of course, SIEM technologies had to evolve for a good reason. Attackers are always changing their campaigns, finding new ways to target our businesses and our employees. We're also finding the environments they're targeting are changing, with the adoption of cloud and container solutions. So we're certainly seeing the attackers evolving, and we need our technologies to evolve to collect the right data as well, which has led to things like looking at a new look at things like correlations. They really need a refresh. Back in the day when we had static systems that didn't really change very often, correlations were quite easy. You could see the anomalies and you could correlate different behaviors, and they would raise some really useful alerts. But of course, these days with systems being up and down all the time and information not coming from a single source and they're ever changing, that makes those correlations that much more difficult, and they need a refresh. We have more data, and a lot of the older SIEM technologies that have been around for a while weren't really designed to handle big data. So they were originally built with a small volume of logs, but of course now that we're increasing the systems we're using, we're scaling them, we're making them much bigger, we're creating more log data, we need a tool that can really effectively respond to that and to ingest the data in a fast way, but of course allow us to search it in a much quicker way than we have been able to previously, to enable our security teams and our people that are already stretched in running a security function to be able to spot incidents as quickly as possible. And of course, we've got this ephemeral hell. So understanding when a system is going to come back or whether it's not going to come back, and if it was tainted, how was it tainted? What were the weaknesses in that system when it was up? Was it already, is it configured incorrectly when it was built? Is it just the version of the system we're running, the gold build of the system vulnerable? And in which case, we need to fix that as quickly as possible. And we need technologies that can support that can ingest the right data to help us to identify those systems. And SIEM technology is a really important part of that as well. Of course, making sure we're pulling in the right data to enable our teams to understand where all the threats are coming from in a single place. One place to go to find out what's going on in the environment and to ask questions of it, and the platform be able to be responsive enough to be able to answer our questions quick enough so we can respond to it, and to assist in, of course, raising events and not causing alert fatigue. So we need to make sure we're monitoring the right things so that teams can respond effectively, they can triage in an efficient way, they don't have lack of information. They need to be able to do that 24/7, or you need a team that's going to do that for you on a 24/7 basis, because as I mentioned earlier, the big thing is, of course, the attackers are going to target you when you least expect it. And we need to make sure that we're maintaining that staff training, making sure they know the environment, as well, because the environment's changing, ever changing these days. So they need to know what good looks like, what normal looks like, and that's tough if you don't have good understanding of, one, the tools you're using, the industry, the security industry itself, and of course the environments they're protecting. And of course, do you have the right technology in place to be able to enable you to do that? Because of course, if you don't, then it's going to be really challenging. And the last part, of course, is it correctly configured? And how do you make sure it's tuned and configured correctly for a long-term security strategy that needs to be considered? And of course, you need to, in order to have an effective solution, you really need it to be tuned well and configured correctly in the first place. For the last couple of slides, what I'm going to do is just going to take you through our SWOT Defense product, how we differ, what we're doing differently to some of the other organizations out there providing similar services, and to give you an idea of how we could help in these scenarios. The main thing is that our technology is more than a log monitoring solution. It's sort of like a blend of SIEM technologies, your traditional SIEM technologies, plus capturing all the extra metadata. So using our experience of doing threat hunting for businesses, for doing forensics investigation, for doing penetration testing and consulting businesses, we've taken that data and we've gone out and built a solution that looks to capture all the things we need to provide an early response and an early way to detect attacks. And of course, we're providing this as a 24/7 service where we're proactively monitoring the environment, looking for the threats that might target the organizations we're protecting and our customers, and of course, helping with investigating those threats and helping them decide what they need to do next. We've got trained security analysts that know how to respond to incident, they know how to do forensics if there's need to, and triage events, and they're highly trained individuals that are looking at log data every day. That's their job, that's all they do, and they're detecting attacks for their customers, which means that they're the experts in this field. The other thing that benefits our sort of technology, as we talked about sort of serverless and containers and all those sorts of things, is that our services can be automated. So it makes it very easy to deploy. It means that it can be deployed in environments that it natively supports, like container technologies and cloud services. So we know where a container is in an environment. We have all the details of what container it is. We also have details around the cloud services, like is it in AWS, is it in Azure, or where is it in AWS, where is it in Azure? And that gives us really good intelligence on how to deal with an event for a customer and how to provide an actionable outcome. The other thing about our service is that we want to make it easy to use. So we're focused on that within the product, making an easy, simple user interface that provides you just the right information for you to be able to triage the incident that's been analysed by an analyst. We also provide the ability for you to tell exactly what's going on, so you can go in and search through that data and look through the evidence provided by the analyst in a simple, easy to use way. We prioritise the events, so not only do you get access to be able to talk to an analyst to help you to identify what the problem is 24/7, as we're a 24/7 service, but it also, we already prioritise those events based on what we know of your environment and the triage that we've already done for that event. So you understand what needs to be done. You know how to remediate the issue, you need to know how to fix the problems, and we provide that. And the last part, of course, is that you have the ability to liaise with those experts at any time. Okay, well, thanks very much everyone for listening. That just about wraps everything up. Just a few more things before we finish up. If you want to learn more, you want to see the SWOT Defense product in action, book a demo with us. We've created a really good piece of content that will help you to make decisions on buying the right SIEM technologies in our buyer's guide. So reach out to us to get a copy of that at webinars@bulletproof.co.uk. I've also reserved some time to answer your questions, so if you have any questions, send them over to me and I'll answer those offline personally. And of course, the last part, we really want you to help us improve these webinars, so there's going to be a survey that's going to pop up. If you could just respond to that, that'd be great. And last but not least, for any other things like our blogs and other really useful bits of information, go to the Bulletproof website at bulletproof.co.uk.